He thought his badge made him untouchable, until he arrested the wrong army general. When a power-hungry cop falsely arrests a 3-star general secretly investigating police misconduct, he discovers that his badge doesn't make him untouchable after all. Officer Derek Slater adjusted his mirrored sunglasses and ran a hand over his meticulously trimmed crew cut. 7 years on the force had taught him one thing. In this small military town of West Point Junction, his badge was power. The locals feared him, his fellow officers resented him in silence, and the law, well, the law was whatever he interpreted it to be on any given day. Another day, another opportunity to remind these people who's in charge, he muttered to himself, pulling his cruiser into the parking lot of Millie's Diner, the town's most popular breakfast spot. The morning had been slow. 2 speeding tickets and 1 warning for a busted taillight. Derek was itching for something more substantial, something that would remind everyone of his authority. He'd built a reputation as someone who didn't take disrespect from anyone, especially the military personnel stationed at the nearby Fort Harmon Army Base. As Derek sipped his coffee at the counter, the bell above the diner's door jingled. In walked an older man in plain clothes, khaki pants and a simple button-down shirt. Nothing remarkable except for his ramrod-straight posture and the quiet authority in his eyes. Derek had seen that look before on military men, and it always ignited something vengeful inside him. The man took a seat at a booth and pulled out a newspaper, exchanging pleasant greetings with Millie as she poured his coffee. 2 younger men in civilian clothes sat at a nearby table, occasionally glancing at the older man with subtle deference. "Who's that?" Derek asked Sally, the waitress refilling his mug. "New in town?" Sally replied with a nervous smile. "That's..." Derek cut her off. "Doesn't matter. Just another one of those military types who thinks they own this town." His radio crackled with a report of a minor traffic incident a few blocks away. Derek took his time finishing his coffee before heading out, deliberately bumping the older man's table as he passed, spilling hot coffee across the man's newspaper and onto his pants. "Watch it," Derek said, despite being the one who had caused the collision. The man calmly grabbed napkins to dab at the spreading stain, his composed expression never faltering. "Accidents happen," he said simply, making eye contact with Derek. Something about the man's unflappable demeanor and direct gaze made Derek's skin prickle. This wasn't the intimidated reaction he was accustomed to receiving. "You should be more careful where you sit," Derek said coldly. "Some spots are in the way of official police business." As we continue with this story, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe if you're against entitled behavior and superiority complex. Welcome to Mr. Black Stories. The man dabbed the last of the coffee from his pants and folded the napkin precisely. "Of course, officer. Perhaps you could explain which spots in a public diner are reserved for the police? I'd like to be better informed for next time." The question was delivered with perfect politeness, but Derek sensed a challenge beneath the words. The diner had gone quiet, every pair of eyes on them. "You think you're funny?" Derek's hand moved to rest on his belt near his badge. "ID, now." Without breaking eye contact or showing a hint of concern, the man reached for his wallet and produced a driver's license. Derek snatched it, reading, "James Marshall, 62, from Arlington, Virginia. Military?" Derek demanded, already knowing the answer. "Yes," Marshall answered simply, his calm demeanor unwavering. "This doesn't tell me much," Derek said, flicking the license back onto the table. "I need to see military ID. We've had problems with people impersonating officers around here." It was a lie, of course. No such reports existed. But Derek had used this tactic before to flex his authority over soldiers who thought too highly of themselves. Marshall raised an eyebrow slightly. "I'm afraid I don't carry that ID with me when I'm off duty and in civilian clothes." Derek's pulse quickened. Here it was, the perfect opportunity to make an example. "Stand up, sir. That's a violation of protocol in a military-adjacent town." All personnel are required to carry proper identification at all times. Officer, I believe you're mistaken about that regulation, Marshall stated matter-of-factly. The two younger men were now watching intently, one discreetly typing something on his phone beneath the table. Are you telling me how to do my job? Derek's voice rose as he took a step closer, placing a hand on his holster, a subtle threat he'd perfected over the years. Not at all, Marshall replied, still maddeningly calm. I'm simply stating a fact about military regulations, which fall under my area of expertise. Stand up, now, Derek barked. Marshall complied without protest, standing with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to carrying authority. Even in this vulnerable position, something about his bearing made him seem like the one in control. Outside, Derek ordered, gesturing toward the door. Marshall walked calmly toward the exit, glancing briefly at the two younger men who remained seated but were both now actively on their phones. Once outside, Derek's theater continued. Hands against the wall. Deep back, he ordered, voice raised for the benefit of onlookers gathering on the sidewalk. Marshall complied precisely, assuming the position with textbook form. Derek patted him down roughly, finding nothing but a phone and some keys. I'm placing you under arrest for disorderly conduct, impersonating military personnel, failure to provide proper identification, and resisting a police officer, Derek announced loudly. I'm not resisting, Marshall said confidently. You're challenging my authority. That's resistance in my book, Derek replied, roughly cuffing the man's hands behind his back, cinching the metal bracelets a notch too tight. Officer Slater, Marshall said, reading Derek's nameplate, you're making a serious mistake. Save it for the judge, Derek snapped, spinning Marshall around to face him. You military types think you run this town. It's time someone reminded you who's really in charge. Ah, so that's what this is all about, Officer Slater. I can assure you it won't go the way you've pictured it in your mind. As Derek began marching Marshall toward his cruiser, a fleet of black SUVs suddenly appeared, surrounding the area. The doors opened simultaneously, and 12 military police officers emerged with military precision, their faces grim. Police officer, stand down, their commander shouted. Derek instinctively reached for his weapon. Touch that weapon and we will open fire, the MP commander warned. Hands up now. Confused and suddenly afraid, Derek slowly raised his hands. The MP commander approached cautiously. On your knees, hands behind your head. Do it now. As Derek complied, the two men from the diner emerged and quickly uncuffed General Marshall, who rubbed his wrists, his face a mask of cold fury. Colonel Sanders, the base liaison, rushed forward from one of the SUVs. General Marshall, sir, are you all right? We came as soon as we got the call. I'm fine, Colonel, Marshall replied, his voice ice, though Officer Slater here seems to have a serious misunderstanding about the limits of his authority. Derek knelt on the pavement, reality crashing down on him as the MPs cuffed his hands behind his back. This is a mistake, he stammered. I'm a police officer. You can't arrest me. Marshall stepped into Derek's line of sight, his bearing now unmistakably that of a high-ranking officer. Gone was any trace of the polite older man from minutes before. Officer Slater, Marshall said, his voice carrying to the growing crowd of onlookers, many recording with their phones, you assaulted a 3-star general of the United States Army while I was conducting an official congressional investigation. You fabricated charges, used excessive force, and confiscated my identification under false pretenses. He paused, letting the words sink in. You thought your badge made you untouchable. You were wrong. The town's police chief pushed through the crowd, his face ashen. General Marshall, I cannot begin to express. Marshall cut him off with a raised hand. Chief Morris, this officer's actions reflect a pattern of misconduct that suggests a systemic failure of leadership and oversight. Based on witness statements we've been collecting for weeks, Officer Slater has been terrorizing military families in this town for years. He turned to an aide. Contact the State Attorney General and the Department of Justice. I want a full investigation of this department, starting today." Looking back at Derek, Marshall continued, "As for you, Officer Slater, you're facing federal charges for assault on a military officer, civil rights violations, and obstruction of a congressional investigation. You'll never wear a badge again. Not in this town, not in this state, not anywhere in this country." Derek's face drained of color as the MPs pulled him to his feet. "The badge you hid behind wasn't meant to elevate you above the law, but to hold you to a higher standard," Marshall said, straightening his coffee-stained pants. "You weaponized it against the very people you swore to protect. Now you'll face the consequences." Marshall watched as Derek was escorted to a waiting vehicle, his expression not vengeful, but resolute. If you believe in accountability and justice, hit subscribe for more stories that will make you stand up and cheer. "The badge is a symbol of public trust," Marshall said to the assembled crowd, which now included several of Derek's fellow officers. "When that trust is betrayed, the damage extends far beyond any single incident. It erodes the foundation of law and order in a community." That evening, as Derek sat in a federal holding cell contemplating the end of his career and the beginning of a prosecution that would likely send him to prison, the local news ran footage of General Marshall announcing a complete restructuring of the town's police department under federal oversight. "The authority granted to law enforcement is a sacred trust, not a weapon to be wielded against those you've sworn to protect," Marshall said during the press conference. "Today marks the beginning of a new chapter for West Point Junction, one where the badge represents protection and service, not intimidation and fear." Derek Slater had spent years believing his badge made him untouchable. In the end, it had made him the perfect example of exactly what was wrong with a system that had forgotten whom it was meant to serve. Justice, as it turned out, didn't always arrive with sirens and flashing lights. Sometimes it arrived in the form of a quiet, dignified man in a coffee-stained cloth, who knew that true authority needed no fanfare, only the unwavering commitment to doing what was right. Share your story in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, hit the subscribe button and stick around for more stories of perseverance and success.